$7.9 trillion. Let that satisfyingly absurd number sink in. Take Apple, take Microsoft, take Amazon, Nvidia, and Saudi Aramco. Stack them all on top of each other. You still won't reach the valuation of this company. The most valuable company in the world right now is Nvidia, and this company was worth twice that. But it wasn't a tech giant. It wasn't an oil conglomerate. It was born 400 years ago in one of the smallest countries in Europe, built on top of swampland by merchants who sold herring and salt. Its name? The Dutch East India Company. The VOC. And this wasn't just the biggest company in history. It conducted the world's first IPO. It built the first stock exchange. It printed the first share certificates. It invented limited liability. It laid the foundation for futures markets. It had its own army, its own navy, its own courts. It could declare war, sign treaties, mint coins, and establish colonies. It operated like a sovereign state. But it wasn't a state. It was a publicly traded company. And behind this company stood a dynasty with no throne but power greater than most monarchs, the House of Orange-Nassau. Today, we're going to tell the story of this family and this company, how a swamp town became the architect of global finance, how the DNA of capitalism was written, and why the fingerprints of the system are still everywhere you look. Buckle in, because this is one of the most important stories you've probably never heard. Our story begins in 1580. Something seismic is happening on the Iberian Peninsula. Spain absorbs Portugal in a personal union. Two global powers merge under a single crown. And overnight, the balance of power across the seas shifts dramatically. Because Portugal, at that time, was the undisputed master of the spice trade. It controlled every major trade route to Asia. It had built a vast network of outposts stretching from the African coast to the Indian Ocean. And now all of that, every port, every route, every warship, fell under Spanish control. For the Dutch, this was catastrophic. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the one country your entire economy depends on just merged with your worst enemy. That's exactly what happened. The Dutch were a seafaring people. Fishing and mercantile shipping was their thing, and they'd been doing it for centuries. But they had no colonies of their own. They bought their spices from Lisbon and shipped them around Europe at a profit. When Spain swallowed Portugal, Lisbon's port was shut to Dutch merchants overnight. Just like that, the main artery of the Dutch economy was gone. And the timing couldn't have been worse. The Netherlands was technically part of the Spanish Empire, but locked in an 80-year war for independence, Protestant Dutch against the devoutly Catholic Spanish monarchy. Tensions had spiraled beyond control. Now, with Portugal's naval power added to Spain's, the Dutch were facing a much larger enemy than before. They knew they couldn't match this force with guns alone. They needed a new kind of weapon, and that weapon would be private capital. But first, someone had to be bold enough to take the first step. In the spring of 1594, near Dam Square, the heart of Amsterdam since its very origins, 10 men held a meeting. It took place in the house of one Martin Spill, a brewer by trade. Around the table sat merchants dealing in timber, salt, and herring. They had ships, they had capital, but they were locked out of the spice trade. The idea on the table that day was simple but audacious: break Portugal's monopoly on spices. And they had the ingredients. Amsterdam had money, expertise, and shipbuilding capacity. Everything was falling into place. One of these men, Cornelis de Houtman, had spent years in Lisbon spying on the Portuguese, learning their routes, their networks, their logistics. He returned to Amsterdam, and preparations began. 3 ships, 249 crew. Nobody in Holland had ever sailed this far. The voyage was a disaster. Scurvy, mutinies, months stranded in Madagascar. When Houtman finally reached Bantam on the island of Java, the Sultan took him prisoner. He escaped, and after more than 2 years, returned to Amsterdam in August 1597. 2/3 of his crew were dead. The ship's holds carried just a few sacks of pepper and spices. By any logical measure, this was a complete failure. But that small group of merchants realized something crucial. They had done it. They had sailed the entire way there, somehow gotten their hands on spices, and come back. They'd beaten the Portuguese, and they realized this was going to work. Over the next 5 years, 75 more ships were sent to Asia. In 1598, Jacob van Nek's fleet of 8 reached the Maluku Islands, the direct source of pepper and nutmeg. When his ships returned, the profit was 400%. But there was a problem. All these companies were competing with each other. Prices in Asia were climbing, and the English, Portuguese, and Spanish weren't sitting idle. The Dutch needed to unite. In April 1602, Dirk van Os, a refugee merchant from Antwerp, turned a room in his house into a temporary office. He'd just been appointed director of a brand new company, and he was about to start selling its shares. 7 separate trading companies had been merged under one roof, sponsored by the Dutch government through the States General, the United East India Company, the VOC. And this company was armed with powers no business had ever held before. It was granted a 21-year monopoly on all Asian trade. But here's where it gets wild. The VOC could sign international treaties with foreign governments. It could raise its own armies. It could wage war against sovereign nations. Let that sink in. A company, not a country, had the legal right to declare war. That's like giving Amazon a private military. It could establish colonies, govern territories, and even execute prisoners. This wasn't a trade license. It was a license to build an empire. But the real revolution happened somewhere else entirely. In the center of Amsterdam, the VOC built a trading house, and it opened its doors to everyone, from wealthy merchants to craftsmen, bronze smiths to domestic servants. Anyone who wanted to could buy shares in the company. This had never happened before in human history. A company was offering its future to ordinary people, the world's first initial public offering. 1,143 people seized the opportunity. Not just traders, carpenters, metalworkers, all sorts of craftspeople, and 7 housekeepers. It was a cross-section of Amsterdam society. Total capital raised, 3,680,000 Dutch guilders, an enormous sum from a country half occupied by Spain, whose economy had been in freefall for a decade. Among those first investors was a housekeeper named Neeltjen Cornelis. She worked in the home of Dirk van Os, and for an entire month had witnessed her employer doing dealings with other company directors. She knew nothing about business, but she knew people. And when she saw how everyone around her was behaving, she knew something big was about to happen. Minutes before midnight on the final day, the bookkeeper heard a knock at the door. The old woman had come to invest 100 guilders. For a servant earning half a cent a day, this was most likely her life savings. The bookkeeper gave his own servant a stake of 50 guilders, 5 minutes before the deadline. Neeltjen's 100 guilders amounted to less than 0.001% of the company's total capital. But that fraction of a $7.9 trillion company works out to just under $196 million in today's money. A housekeeper had become a shareholder in the most valuable company in human history. But not everyone was happy with how the VOC was being run. The most significant early conflict involved Isaac Maire, a hugely wealthy merchant and the company's largest shareholder. He saw the board stacked with insiders, watched debt eat into profits, and noticed directors enriching themselves while ignoring feedback. When he accused them of manipulating share prices, they retaliated, accusing him of embezzlement. Litigation followed. Isaac lost. He was kicked out of the VOC and banned from trading. But Isaac got his revenge. He set up a rival company outside the VOC's jurisdiction, and his son Jacob discovered alternative trade routes around Cape Horn. The passage was even named Maire Strait. More importantly, Isaac became history's first corporate activist, setting a precedent for shareholder rights that remains essential to this day. But Isaac's story was just one thread in a much larger fabric. Because the VOC wasn't just changing who could own a company, it was changing how ownership itself worked. For those who couldn't pay up front, the VOC created another innovation: installment plans. An investor could pledge a sum and pay it off over time. This broadened the investor base and stabilized the company's finances. But missing your payments carried real consequences. You could lose your shares, your reputation, and in a world where you couldn't just pack up and move to another city, that meant everything. So when some investors saw financial trouble ahead, they sold their stakes instead. On March 3rd, 1603, a man named Jan Allert became the first person to sell the rights to his shares. 2,400 guilders to Maria van Egmond, 600 to Mrs. von Barum. The shares had risen since he first bought them, so he walked away with a modest profit. Active stock trading had just been invented. At first, these trades happened on a small bridge near the harbor, right next to market stalls selling meat and grain. On rainy days, people moved inside the abandoned St. Olaf Church, seized from Catholics after the Protestant victory and left to Amsterdam's traders. That bridge and that church were humanity's first stock exchange. You'd make your trade, then walk to VOC headquarters for signatures and stamps. Deal done. By 1611, trading volume had grown so large that Amsterdam opened a purpose-built exchange. The architect, Hendrik de Keyser, drew inspiration from exchanges in Antwerp and London. But Amsterdam had something neither of those had: company shares being traded alongside merchandise. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange became the world's first true securities market, and the innovations kept coming. Traders weren't just buying and selling shares. They started betting on what prices would do tomorrow. Speculation and arbitrage were born. Futures contracts, derivatives, every tool Wall Street uses today was forged right here in Amsterdam. Limited liability was another VOC invention. If a ship sank or a trade route collapsed, investors only lost what they'd put in. Their personal property stayed safe. Their families stayed secure. This single concept transformed human willingness to invest. It's a principle we still use today, separating personal assets from business liabilities. The VOC also printed stamped, signed share certificates that could be freely exchanged. For the first time ever, ownership was tangible, portable, and transferable. No royal permission needed, no family inheritance required. This was revolutionary. Think about what just happened. In the space of a few years, a single company invented the stock market, limited liability, share certificates, and installment investing, every pillar of modern finance, built in a small city on a swamp, Wall Street, the London Stock Exchange, every brokerage account you've ever opened. All of it traces back to Amsterdam. But there's one more chapter to this financial story, and it reveals something uncomfortable about human nature. Behind all the markets and the math, there was something else driving everything forward. Fear of missing out. VOC shares were one of history's first great cases of FOMO. From an index value of 100 in 1602, shares climbed to roughly 1,000 by the 1720s, a tenfold increase. Everyone wanted in. Merchants, artisans, servants. They all wanted a piece of this great economic engine. And at one point, that market euphoria spiraled out of control. Through the Tulip Mania. Tulips arrived in Europe from Turkey in 1554 and were immediately perceived as exotic luxury goods. Having tulips in your garden became a serious status symbol, and the thing about tulips is they take 7 to 12 months to flower and only bloom for about a week. This rarity made them a prime candidate for the first financial bubble in history. Dutch traders devised a market where tulips could be traded year-round, even when they weren't in bloom, contracts based on future prices. The world's first futures derivative market. Speculators pushed prices higher and higher. Some merchants sold everything they owned to buy a few bulbs. In a single month, prices exploded 20-fold. At the peak, one tulip bulb was worth 10 times a craftsman's annual wage. Then, like all bubbles, it popped. In late 1636, some buyers simply stopped showing up to auctions. Investors panicked and sold. Within weeks, bulbs were worth 1/100th of their former price. Holland plunged into economic crisis. Sound familiar? It should. Because this exact pattern, euphoria, speculation, crash, has repeated itself in every bubble since. The dot-com boom, the housing crisis, crypto. The script never changes because human nature never changes. But even beyond the tulip crash, a colossal operation was turning behind the VOC's financial machinery. During the company's golden era, from the early 1600s to the mid-1700s, over 1 million people departed the Netherlands bound for Asia. These weren't explorers or adventurers. They were employees of a mega-corporation. Sailors, clerks, soldiers, craftsmen, all sailing across oceans to build the VOC's trade empire. At its peak, the company commanded over 150 merchant ships, 40 warships, 50,000 employees, and a private army of 10,000 soldiers. Its reach stretched from the Persian Gulf to Japan. In 1610, the VOC gained permission to build an outpost near the Siliwang River. By 1619, they captured Jakarta and renamed it Batavia. This wasn't just a name change. Batavia became the center of gravity in Asia, the company's command hub for 300 years. The Dutch influence you see in Indonesia today, in food, language, architecture, culture, is the legacy of this era. The VOC's operations extended far beyond spices. Its factories in India produced silks and textiles, which were shipped to Japan and traded for silver. Chinese porcelain and silk flowed through the network. Profit margins could reach 1,500%, and all of that money was being funneled back into Amsterdam. The company also sponsored exploration. In 1609, English navigator Henry Hudson was hired to find a northeast passage to Asia. He failed, but along the way, he mapped the river that now bears his name and charted the northeastern coast of North America. A few years later, the Dutch West India Company founded New Amsterdam at the southern tip of Manhattan, a small trading outpost that would one day become the financial capital of the world. And here, the story gains another dimension, the House of Orange-Nassau. When people think of capitalism, wealth creation, and old money, the first names that come to mind are usually the Rothschilds or the Rockefellers. But those figures didn't invent the model. They followed it. Long before any of them, there was the House of Orange. This was one of the most prominent dynasties of the era, but they held no kingdoms. In a republic run by merchants, they carried a weak title and maintained a fragile peace. Their traditional nobility counted for little in this new order. They were squeezed from both sides. Amsterdam's elites pushed for tighter republican control. Spain wanted the dynasty extinguished. They had no land to rule, no mines to drain. As the old order collapsed, the House of Orange faced a choice: fade into irrelevance or adapt. They adapted. They used the only thing they had left, capital. They didn't run the VOC directly, but they helped bankroll it. More importantly, they tied their future to it. This wasn't symbolic. It was strategic positioning in a world where legacy no longer guaranteed power. Decades later, the connection became official. William IV and William V, descendants of the House of Orange, served as presidents of both the VOC and the West India Company. They effectively became among the most powerful men in the country and in Europe. Still without crowns. but their power was backed by dividends. The House of Orange understood something early. Capital could be more potent than crowns. Ruling through markets instead of thrones, at that time, this was revolutionary. Now, picture this. It's November 1688. An armada of 463 ships, larger than the Spanish Armada, is crossing the English Channel. But these aren't warships coming to conquer. On board is a Dutch prince, William of Orange, carrying something far more powerful than cannons. An idea. England was in crisis. King James II had lost the trust of Parliament. The British needed a Protestant with a claim to the throne, and James's daughter Maire happened to be married to William of Orange. William didn't just bring troops. He brought a mindset forged in the Dutch Republic, one that merged capital with governance. He saw markets not as distractions from power, but as instruments of it. History remembers this as the Glorious Revolution, and it was, but not in the way most people think. William and Mary II took the English throne in a rare joint monarchy. Within years, England launched the Bank of England, created public credit, introduced government bonds, and began funding wars through capital markets. Every single one of these was a Dutch innovation, now written into British law. The financial architecture of the most powerful empire in history was built on a Dutch blueprint. And then there's New York. Walk down Wall Street today. The name itself comes from a defensive wall the Dutch built in 1653 to protect New Amsterdam. The street where global finance lives was literally built by the same people who invented it. When the British took over in 1664, they kept the Dutch legal systems and financial customs, because they worked. Amsterdam's bank-oriented finance merged with London's market-oriented system, and that blend crossed the Atlantic. New York absorbed the tools that once powered Europe's financial centers, and built the most powerful version the world has ever seen. From VOC charter ports to Wall Street, from the London Stock Exchange to the halls of Parliament, Dutch finance didn't just influence the modern world, it designed it. But even a giant has limits. And the VOC didn't die from a single wound. It bled out slowly, killed not by its enemies, but by the very system it created. By the late 1700s, the spice trade, the foundation of the VOC's wealth, was collapsing. Supply exceeded demand, competitors offered better prices, and consumer tastes were shifting. Cotton, sugar, tea, coffee, products the VOC's trade routes didn't carry, were on the rise. The irony is brutal. The money the VOC generated was used by investors to develop the very industries that rendered it obsolete. The company tried to pivot from low-volume, high-margin spice trading to high-volume, low-margin commodities. But that required a massive expansion of operations. It doubled its fleet, took on enormous debt, but profit margins didn't keep pace. From 1680 to 1720, returning ship tonnage rose 125%, but profits only climbed 78%. The ship was getting bigger, but the wind was dying. Internal governance had rotted from the inside. Decision-making turned sluggish. Officials focused more on filling their own pockets than steering the company forward. Corruption was rampant. The bureaucracy that had once been the VOC's greatest strength became the anchor dragging it under. In 1780, the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War delivered the killing blow. Britain had eclipsed the Dutch as the dominant maritime power. The Royal Navy shattered VOC fleets and seized trading posts from Indonesia to South Africa. By the war's end, loans to keep the company afloat were no longer viable. On March 1st, 1796, the Dutch East India Company was formally nationalized. Its remaining assets, including its debts and colonial administration, were absorbed by the state. After nearly 2 centuries as the richest corporation on earth, the company that invented modern capitalism quietly closed its doors. The warehouses stood empty, the ships stopped sailing, and the share certificates that once made housekeepers into millionaires were worth nothing. But this story has a dark chapter that must be told. Behind the VOC's financial innovations lay an enormous human cost. On the Banda Islands, the indigenous population was nearly exterminated. Thousands were killed, survivors were enslaved, and the company replaced local people with Dutch settlers. On Ambon Island, VOC officials tortured and executed English and Japanese traders on suspicion of conspiracy. In Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, thousands of Chinese civilians were massacred in 1740. Across spice-producing regions, the VOC established forced labor systems. Indigenous populations were compelled to cultivate crops for the company's benefit, leading to widespread suffering and deprivation. Resistance was crushed with military force. Local political structures were dismantled. The VOC contributed enormously to modern finance, but the cost at which those contributions came must never be forgotten. So what about today? The Netherlands is no longer a seafaring empire, but it is a financial empire. Its influence is felt in boardrooms, international treaties, and offshore accounts. The numbers speak for themselves. Dutch foreign direct investment flows exceed $4.3 trillion inward and $5.2 trillion outward. Dutch holdings abroad surpass $3.5 trillion, an astonishing footprint for a country with fewer people than California. And behind this enormous capital network, the House of Orange-Nassau still casts a very long shadow. The crown may be ceremonial, but the connections are anything but symbolic. From defense to energy to corporate governance, the royal family remains deeply tied to Dutch industry. In 1907, Royal Dutch merged with Shell Transport and Trading Company to form Royal Dutch Shell, a name that would dominate global energy for over a century. And once again, a Dutch company carried not only capital but a royal title. Shell wasn't alone. ING Group stands as one of Europe's most powerful financial institutions, built on Dutch foundations. The corporate architecture and legal protections from the VOC era still echo in these structures. The merchants and businessmen tied to the VOC, their descendants now hold stakes in modern corporate giants. Some sit quietly on boards, others shape policy through foundations and capital networks. Their names rarely make headlines, but their blueprints are everywhere, from oil to banking to logistics to global trade. From the rise of the VOC to the reign of Royal Dutch Shell, from Amsterdam's canals to Wall Street, a pattern emerges. Power and capital are always inseparable. The House of Orange realized this early. They transformed trade into a corporate-state hybrid and scaled that model across centuries and continents. They left a legacy that defines how the world governs money today. The Netherlands may no longer rule the seas, but Dutch capital now moves across borders with more influence than fleets ever could. And that brings us to a question that still matters enormously today. If markets now hold the power that was once reserved for monarchs, then who governs the markets? Who holds the crown when the crown is invisible?